Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to episode 7 of our webinar series, which has been running since August of last year. And today we're going to focus on the Cyber Essentials scheme, Cyber Essentials, proving you take security seriously. And the key word there is about proving. It's about proving that your organization does take cybersecurity and privacy seriously, and the reasons why that's so important. As always, we've got 4 or 5 key subjects we're going to look at through the duration of the session. We're going to look at the current cyber threat data and some really interesting stats that have surfaced towards the end of last year and the beginning of the new year, which will be quite significant to review. We're going to talk about supply chain risk and why suppliers are critical to all aspects of cybersecurity. And for those who are interested, there is a really significant incident in the United States at the moment, which is very closely linked to the supply chain in healthcare and pharmacies. We'll talk about contracts, bids, and tenders in relation to Cyber Essentials, and then we'll talk about the Cyber Essentials scheme itself and the 5 controls which are central to the scheme itself. There'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. However, I have asked the guys to chip in and answer a question then and there if they feel that it's timely. Today's panelists, I'm joined by my colleagues from ClearComm, Maritz, Cloete, and Shah. And I'll ask them to introduce themselves briefly in a moment, but we'll start with a really useful quote from Stefan Napo about the fact that it does take years, 20 years, according to Stefan, to build a reputation and just a few minutes of cyber incident to ruin it. And I think that's why it's so important to focus not only on having the right controls and cyber defenses in place, but also to make sure that you keep on top of that and there's evidence and you can prove it. So that's very much the sort of running through today's theme. So Maritz and Paris, if I could ask you just to briefly introduce yourselves, and then we'll kick off with today's webinar.
Okay, so yeah, just a quick introduction to me, Maritz. I'm Director of Cybersecurity and IT Assurance Services here at ClearComm. So myself and my team look after quite a lot of clients, cybersecurity compliance, for example. Obviously, my team does the Cyber Essentials assessment as well, because we're Cyber Essentials certification body. And anytime our clients have got queries or concerns or want to do some more detailed reviews of what their cybersecurity posture looks like, that's when we'll sort of step in and sort of carry out that work and really sort of try and help our clients determine what the best strategy is moving forward in terms of what are the key areas they need to hit first, where's the biggest risk areas for them as an organization, because every organization's risk profile is a little bit different. Every organization is maybe affected slightly different by cyber threats. So that's a quick introduction about me.
Thanks, Maritz.
Hi, everyone. My name is Paris. So I am one of the cybersecurity consultants at ClearComm, and I'm also a Cyber Essentials assessor. And I generally take care of a lot of the gap assessments that we do for Cyber Essentials, as Maritz mentioned, and really helping a lot of our clients meet the requirements of Cyber Essentials before they go through certification, or if they choose not to, at least implement the controls to secure their environment.
Thanks, Paris. And as the guy said, that we are a certified body for Cyber Essentials, and Paris and Maritz are experts in the scheme, not only in the mechanics of it, but also the benefits and the reasons for organizations considering Cyber Essentials. So hopefully that will come across during today's session. So we'll look briefly at the current cyber threat, global crime data at the moment taken from various sources. If you've joined us in previous webinars and you're one of our regular audience, you'll see that some of these stats are familiar. However, these are the latest, and it's really significant. We're seeing that global cost of cybercrime surging again, significantly from 8.4 trillion only 2 years ago to about probably around 24 trillion by 2027. So it's vastly increasing year on year. We're seeing that a huge proportion of organizations are seeing their accounting and financial data deliberately targeted by cyber adversaries last year. A couple of stats there about artificial intelligence, AI, and that's something that I know we get asked about a lot as a team, and in terms of what is the impact of AI on cybercrime. I'm mentioning authorized push payment fraud, APP, in the UK, because I think that's something that, again, we're being asked a lot about by clients, and I'd be more than happy for myself or the team to answer questions about APP, either during today's session or questions that we follow up. This is when organizations are encouraged fraudulently to make a payment to a cyber criminal's bank account, for instance, and it's really prevalent globally, but in the UK significantly so, to the point where there's almost £500 million worth of losses last year, 2022, sorry. And just a general stat at the end, half of mobile phone owners worldwide are being exposed to phishing attacks every quarter. So some really significant stats there. And in the National Cybersecurity Centre's most recent breach survey, we can see some differences in terms of the size of the organization or the size of the charity in terms of their experiences of breaches and attacks, and the proportion of micro businesses, for instance, that are saying that cybersecurity is less of a priority, which is really interesting to see. And that's a theme which we'll see during today's webinar, actually, that this kind of slight decrease in some areas. And I'd invite Maritz and Paris just to sort of comment at the moment in terms of some of the stats, and especially the final 3 bullet points there, and what our experience is in terms of what might be going on there.
I think the micro business stat is important because I think it just shows, it sort of reflects where the economy is as well at the moment in terms of where businesses have to prioritize certain aspects of the business, in terms of survival. That's probably the first one. But there's a lot of challenges businesses face. They've got a massive amount of increased costs over the last 2 or 3 years. Everything, inflation is just absolutely mad in terms of running a business, absolutely. So I can see why cybersecurity might slip down in the list of priorities. And that's sort of life, really, right? You have to make a decision over where you want to spend your time and your energy, as long as it's not as a result of just not paying attention to cybersecurity. I think again, cybersecurity is found its place in the business in terms of its appropriate level of priority. But yeah, so I think that's probably one of the big items that sort of pushes the priority of cybersecurity down a little bit, just generally, because there are bigger problems. The business, actually, some businesses face bigger problems that are real and now, as opposed to cybersecurity, which might be an issue further down the line.
I think parallel to that, the number of threats and attackers that are out there are increasing at the same time, as we're seeing a lot of non-technical attackers are out there. You'll hear of ransomware as a service, where somebody who's very, very low level, they don't have any technical knowledge, they've been able to get in, breach systems. So at the same time, where the priorities are dropping, the number of threats and the threat to businesses is not decreasing, it's increasing. So which Cyber Essentials looks to reduce at a baseline level, at least.
And I think the evidence is still there that cyber attackers tend to exploit companies who don't do the basics from a cybersecurity perspective. Don't do sort of the basic cyber, or don't really carry out or continue to carry out the bits and pieces they need to do just to make sure that they sort of cover the basic cyber hygiene side of the business. And it is difficult. We'll talk through some of the controls. Some of the controls aren't that easy to manage, especially if you use an IT service provider, which may not be officially contracted, or that may not be officially part of the SLA to sort of cover off the slightly more rigorous approach that you need to take for compliance with, or for alignment with the Cyber Essentials requirements. But I would say for each organization, those Cyber Essentials controls are probably the bare minimum that you should have in place, to sort of prevent you from being vulnerable to being spotted as a vulnerable company or vulnerable organization on the internet, and then ultimately being exploited, resulting in ransomware or data loss or any of the sort of other bad impacts that a cyber attack might have.
Yeah, it's interesting whenever we run these webinars and we put the stats on screen, that we always see there's 3 sectors in particular that always stand out in these stats. We're showing charities here, for instance. I would put healthcare and education into the same bucket. And so basically what you've got there is 3 sectors that wouldn't necessarily be seen as, they don't exist for the purpose of generating profit as such, but they process high volumes of data. For the most part, it's very sensitive. So for instance, we're seeing charities, they're high income charities, almost as likely as the average medium business to suffer an attack. And I know that, for instance, a primary school in the UK is statistically more likely to be attacked than the average business. So so that it's really important, I think. And these are probably, I mean, I don't know what your take is on this, but keeping that in mind, do enough schools and charities, for instance, look at Cyber Essentials as something they should have?
That's actually a really good question, but I think it comes back to the economics of it, because all those organizations are having a tough time from an economical perspective, from just running the organization perspective, and trying to deliver the mission with the sort of resources they have. And I think that's probably why they are possibly more likely to be targeted and successfully targeted by cyber attackers, because the cyber defenses just aren't necessarily there, and aren't necessarily maintained, because it can't be a focus of the business, even though it should be. So I think there's a lot of space in this areas for trying to find methods to implement some of these cybersecurity controls without having a massive operational overhead and a financial overhead. And unfortunately, some of the controls do require time and effort, and potentially a bit of investment as well.
Yeah,
but it does put business in a very difficult position. And also, cybersecurity is very much more of an insurance policy to an extent, that approach, because it's in itself, it doesn't generate revenue.
no.
It doesn't improve revenue necessarily, but it is there to protect the resilience of the business, of the organization. So it's sometimes difficult for organizations to see the risk, because they don't necessarily see the risk on the bottom line. All they see is the cost of that. They only see the real impact of something when something bad happens, and it then has a clear impact on your bottom line.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you only have to talk to organizations that have been through the experience, and they would immediately say it's well worth having. But sometimes you have to feel the pain to see the gain, don't you? We were chatting before the webinar about these stats in particular, because it does suggest an evidence of decline in cyber hygiene, but you think in a couple of cases there might be some reasons behind this that might not be obvious?
Yeah, so I think the use of password policies, what we've seen in the last few years is the rise of multi-factor authentication. So either requiring a second factor to log in, like a PIN code, or an authentication on your mobile device. So I think that might have led a few organizations to relax password policies a little bit and be a little bit less strict, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because MFA is that sort of extra safety net, so that you don't just rely on the username and the password, which can potentially be easily guessed, or potentially be breached in other sites or on the internet, like you've been pwned, and then attackers might use that in the password spray attack to try and attack other sites with the same credentials. Yeah. So I think that first one is probably, I wouldn't say it's right, but I can sort of see that an element of that might be because authentication has changed over the last few years, which is sort of an indication that, or maybe another prompt to everybody on the call, if you're sort of in charge of the IT environment or can prove a bit of direction, make sure that wherever there's public logins or the ability to log in publicly to a service, that you use multi-factor authentication, because it is still one of the more effective means of protecting yourself against account takeover. I think the second one, which is the use of network firewalls, again, due to COVID, a lot of organizations have still, and even now with some of the move back to the office, that hybrid working has sort of changed the office infrastructure to a large extent, where essentially the offices tend to be touchdown points rather than organized offices. So a lot of the dependence has gone back onto the laptop or the desktop or laptop controls around software firewalls, for example. So it probably depends on how this question was asked, but when you talk about network firewalls, it's much less of at least for the office environment, it's much less of a key control these days, because most people work from home, right? So or a lot of people work from home for a lot of the time. So the office infrastructure is probably simplified a lot. And with everything moving to the cloud as well, that just means that a lot of organizations might not be relying on network firewalls as their main source of protection. Paris, did you want to talk about the other two?
Yeah, so restricting admin rights, I think I could just talk talk into some experience we've had when we do some cyber essentials assessments. A lot of small businesses, even medium-sized businesses, there will be a lot of senior level staff in there which may need administrative rights to cloud services or even their laptops to install software. They shouldn't really be using them as their everyday account, since their purpose is not to administrate or configure settings day to day. So we've seen a large decline in this in terms of segregation of administrative rights, and there's not much governance around the risks that they might present. So these administrators don't know the risks that are there when they're using it. If their accounts are breached with administrative rights, that could potentially lead to the organization for attackers to traverse through the organization and reach other sources of data. Software security updates. So this is quite critical, where patching is not generally applied. There are a lot of tools, and we see this with IT providers, if it's not specifically agreed within SLAs, where patching should be carried out within a set period of time. It opens up the organization to a lot of vulnerabilities where software issues have come up, the vendors have fixed them, but those issues or vulnerabilities could allow attackers a door pathway into your systems. So it's important for patching to happen as quick as possible. 14 days is still quite. I think there's a term you used for that, Maritz, didn't you? But 14 days is still quite optimistic to say for some.
The organization.
Yeah.
I think the interesting thing is when we do quite a lot of security penetration testing, and the absolute first thing we do is we look for vulnerabilities. When we scan or look at a piece of infrastructure, we look at software missing updates and software vulnerabilities, because that's the easiest way into a system. So if you have a system that's that's got a vulnerability that's fairly critical, it could take an attacker literally seconds to get access to that machine at a very, very privileged level, and from there essentially pivot and basically move through the rest of the organization. So software security updates is so critical, and it's actually quite concerning to see that it's dropped down so far, because it's making the job of the attackers much easier ultimately.
Yeah. Is it fair to say, looking at listening to what you've both said there, that generally the way that organizations are operating has obviously significantly changed in the last 3 to 4 years, but perhaps the operationally organizations have not kept up with that rate of change and are not adapting quickly enough to making sure that the standards are consistently applied, and there's that sort of natural then drop off?
It might be the case, but I think it's maybe just risk tolerance or risk appetite. It's like any risk, flooding risk to the buildings. It's like fire risk, that sort of thing. I mean, it's a risk of something that might happen, and it's about the perceived impact that could have on the business. And because it's not a threat that's always there and present and materializing all the time, over time, as managers and business owners focus change onto other operational stuff, then the focus may move away from these areas, especially if if you sort of have outsourced IT, and that might just fall away slowly but surely. And unless you've got some proper monitoring mechanisms in place, it may be that you find yourself in a position like this in 2 years' time, and you go, how did we get there? But actually, it was just a slow decline. Yeah, because there's not been sufficient focus in the business to make sure these key things are being done.
Oh yeah. So is this a fair statement in light of everything there? I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think that regardless of the reasons, that's a fact, isn't it? The threat's increasing, defenses are for whatever reason decreasing, and one thing that, and I know that as a team we're always highly conscious of, is that our clients and our future clients, cybersecurity and data protection and privacy is not the only thing that they have to worry about. And I know, Maritz, you always talk about proportionality, and it's so important. We do kind of empathize with the fact that organizations might be fighting for survival per se on a day-to-day basis, and that maybe has impacted on them taking their eye off the ball in these areas. But it does, as we say, leave them exposed to critical threats. So with that all in mind, let's talk about Cyber Essentials. So are you happy to sort of talk us through this? I mean, I imagine you know this stuff inside out, back to front. So
I can do a quick spiel, really.
yeah.
So I mean, Cyber Essentials was first introduced back in 2014. So the scheme's almost 10 years old now, and it basically came from the NCSC, who was sort of part of the UK part of the sort of the public side of the intelligence services, basically going, so how can we boil down all these complicated security standards that are out there into something that's sort of bite-sized for smaller organizations, so we can actually improve the overall cybersecurity resilience of UK PLC. They recognize that there's something like 4 million small businesses out there, if not more, small and medium enterprises, who don't necessarily have the level of resource available to large organizations have to focus on this problem within the business. So they came up with a Cyber Essentials scheme, which we'll talk about the detail in a little bit. But actually, I think over the last 9 years or so that it's been in place, it's actually proven to be quite effective in terms of repelling a lot of the sort of more commodity type attacks out there. So that's sort of what we call sort of the drive-by attacks, where an attacker might sort of scan your network and go, oh, there's a vulnerable service, let's see if we can exploit it, and then manage to get access into your environment. Because having these controls in place actually does practically help and protect your environment. It's a bit like putting locks on your doors, locking the windows, making sure that you've got burglar bars installed, or making sure you've got an alarm installed. So it's like basic security stuff to stop somebody from walking into their house and stealing all your jewelry. That's really what Cyber Essentials is all about. So it's gone through a couple of minor updates. You'll see IASME there. IASME is the contracted sort of, they sort of manage the scheme on behalf of the National Cybersecurity Centre, and they sort of govern the scheme as well. And all of the certification bodies really answer to IASME. We've got contracts with IASME, carry out the Cyber Essentials certification piece. Very stringent requirements. The marking scheme is very stringent. They're very black and white in terms of that's what the requirement says, therefore that's what you need to do. And I think that's been really good to sort of really embed the standard out there. I think last time we checked, there was probably 50,000 companies that's done Cyber Essentials. But I imagine there's probably more companies that's taken the controls and are just implementing the controls within the business without necessarily going for certification. Because that certification isn't necessarily, it's more important to pick up the controls and implement them within your business rather than necessarily getting certification, because that's certification has got benefits, and we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah.
But really just putting those protections within the business, within your IT infrastructure is 99% more important, I think, because that's the bits that are really going to stop you from becoming a victim in most instances.
Yeah.
So the scheme is suitable whilst the scheme was designed for smaller businesses to start off with. Actually, what's shown over time is even larger organizations have struggled to meet these basic requirements, because the larger the organization, the more complex the IT environment, the harder it is to actually get to a point where your infrastructure meets these 5 requirements, which is surprising, but that does show how sort of underpinning these 5 areas are to good cybersecurity hygiene. So I think that's probably all I need to say about the scheme. Paris, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
I think you covered it all there.
Yeah, I mean, I think my experience over the sort of the last 4 to 5 years as someone who's been initially just aware of the scheme itself, and then someone who's involved in helping organizations to benefit from it, is the three key takeaways really. Is that one, it's the controls that are involved in Cyber Essentials are really no more than what every organization should routinely have in place anyway. So there's not asking for anything special, for want of a better word. That, you know, this is the kind of thing that every organization should have. 2, that it's incredibly affordable in terms of the benefit versus the investment. The fees for Cyber Essentials are surprisingly affordable, and most organizations maybe assume that it's expensive, and it's not. And then the third is there's the stat that Maritz mentioned there, that, you know, there's, I think at any one time, sort of 40 to 50,000 organizations that are certified, which is incredibly low as a percentage against the amount of organizations and businesses in the UK. So there's a huge opportunity there, I think, for UK Limited, for want of a better phrase, to actually raise its standards as a whole, isn't it? And that's the great part of it. You know, it's there, it's affordable, it's beneficial.
I think something that's been brought up quite often with clients is their clients are requesting where they stand with their cybersecurity controls, and if they've got Cyber Essentials certification, they can just provide that to give that assurance where, you know, this is what we're doing, and it's been independently authorized, independently assured as well. So that's another benefit of the scheme. So.
Sure. And I know there's some more benefits on the screen now. I know we're going to talk in a bit more depth about supply chain resilience, but could you sort of talk us through a little bit about one of the main ethoses of Cyber Essentials being about supply chain and what that means?
Yeah, I guess one of the big benefits is it's a common set of controls that's fairly easy to evidence, reasonably easy to evidence. And if those controls are implemented up and down the supply chain, then generally the whole supply chain improves from a cybersecurity strategy. There's obviously also cybersecurity posture. There's obviously other risks and other security issues that you need to consider, but having Cyber Essentials sort of all across the site, all across the supply chain actually really does make quite a big difference. And the main reason I would say that as well is because supply chain is is a nice target for attackers. Even the small organizations, in some way, shape, or form, they maybe play a role in actually supplying larger organizations. So you may be used as a conduit to get to the large organizations, and large organizations are worried about their third parties being used as a conduit to get to them. So if we can strengthen the whole supply chain, that makes that attack vector a little bit harder for attackers to sort of exploit as well. So I think that's why having some sort of process whereby we can make sure that our suppliers are Cyber Essentials, especially the ones where we share data with, who potentially accesses our systems, who interface with our systems, where there's that cyber link between the organizations. Certainly for those ones, you want to make sure that they've got Cyber Essentials, at least at the basic level, but ideally at plus. You know, so we'll talk. I don't think we really talked about basic and plus, but we can probably cover that off in a bit as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Did you think it's the case that this is a kind of speculative sort of question, really? Do you think that most organizations make an assumption that their suppliers are secure?
I think most organizations don't even ask the question.
Okay,
because again, they don't. If you haven't been involved in an incident like that, it's not necessarily going to be something that's at the fore of your mind when you, for example, contract a new company to maintain your air conditioning units. But actually, one of the big breaches in the US happened because the company that was actually maintaining the air conditioning units had usernames and passwords for the building management system, which then allowed the attackers to get into the building management system. The building management system was connected to the wider network, banged on the wider network, massive data breach. So yeah, so I think the issue is most organizations don't really think that their supply chain could actually be a source of a cyber attack as well.
No. I think in general, supply chains have probably grown exponentially over the years because it is so cost effective in so many instances to outsource something that a business might have done for themselves over the years, and so that increases the links in the chain, which I guess increases the potential for something going wrong and one of those suppliers being hit, doesn't it?
I just had a question in the group, which is a very common question we get quite regularly, which is, if you are 27001 accredited, is there any point in taking Cyber Essentials as well? It's a very interesting question. What I would say on that one is, I would say yes, it is definitely worth doing Cyber Essentials as well. And the reason for that being is ISO 27001 is a standard around how to manage information security as a whole. What that doesn't tell your partners or your customers or your suppliers is that these specific controls have been implemented and is operating effectively. ISO 27000 is very much a risk-based approach. So, for example, if you've assessed the risk around patching, and for whatever reason your risk management process said, "Now we don't need to do patching," you know, what Cyber Essentials says is there's no risk-based approach, because these are the basic cyber hygiene stuff. You have to do patching. You have to separate admin accounts from user accounts, and so on and so forth. So I would say the two probably there's a massive amount of overlap. The Cyber Essentials questions can be fed into ISO 27001, into your management system to make sure that you manage them. But I think there's still value in getting the Cyber Essentials stamp on the side of that, because again, that gives you a very specific assurance over a very specific set of controls.
Yeah. Would that reflect in the fact that so many supply chains, bids and tenders are asking for Cyber Essentials Plus as opposed to ISO 27001?
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations might start asking for both.
Yeah.
And if you don't do both, they'll probably ask additional questions over and above the 27001 questions.
Mm.
But we're also seeing other standards like SOC 2 coming through as well. So, and whilst ISO 27000 is a brilliant standard, I think organizations are starting to ask more specific questions around security risks and specific security risks.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of where the Cyber Essential scheme is still really useful. I mean, a basic assessment is like between 300 and 500 quid. So you almost want to say, well, actually, if you've done 27001 already, you might as well invest another £400 or £500 for your large organization to get your Cyber Essential certification as well, because then you've got that to show that yes, you do 27001, but actually we definitely do those basic cyber hygiene controls.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what else?
Yeah, so I'll ask you to. So we talk about Cyber Essentials, 5 controls which are central to the certification. So I'd invite you both to pick your poison and run through them.
Yeah, I'll let Paris sort of cover off a few of these.
Okay.
That's fine. So firewalls and routers, I think it touches on some points Maritz raised earlier as well, where a lot of the workforce has moved to working from home with this hybrid structure now. So most of the assessments will come back and say, well, we've not got any controls in place, but there is still a boundary between your data and the internet. So it's really where those security controls are applied. So Cyber Essentials is looking at how you apply your firewall controls. Are they applied with a business case? Are they necessary for the business operations? And have you done the correct signposting internally to make sure that the data and the access is still secure on that end? The second area is secure configuration. So that's looking at how you configure your systems, your internal devices, your laptops, etc., including your software as well. So an example of that would be allowing users to change their settings where they're not required to do so as part of their role. So that's a potential risk where accidentally users might enable or disable anti-malware, antivirus software, or might enable configurations that will create a vulnerability an attacker could use. So security updates, that we covered this off in a couple of slides earlier, where we're talking about patching. So this is looking at patching within 14 days in the scheme, though we do suggest to either enable automatic updates where available, or update as soon as possible once the updates have been released by the vendor. So this, of course, will enable you to patch any vulnerabilities that are out there. So just as for those who are technical on the call, they're looking at CVSS scores. So generally, Cyber Essentials asks you to patch all vulnerabilities, but when it comes to Plus, we're looking at vulnerabilities above CVSS 7. Maritz, do you want to cover off the rest?
Yeah, we'll do. I'll probably just say on security updates, it's not just your operating security updates, it's also updates for applications that you've got installed on your machine as well. So that would be things like your Adobes and all the other sort of non-Microsoft applications that you may have installed on your machine. So it does have a fairly broad scope, and it also looks at your server infrastructure. So it's not just the endpoint side of things. It's also your server infrastructure, particularly the servers that are internet facing as well. But the scope has recently been increased to sort of cover off all infrastructure, because essentially any machine that's compromised could become a pivot point for an attacker to get into the rest of the network as well. So they do sort of cover that off, and they're very strict about the security update rules, about the 14-day rules. And the reason the 14-day rule is there, and actually it's probably a little bit long, but that's how quickly, when a patch is released, what cyber criminals do is they'll reverse engineer the software patch to figure out what is the actual vulnerability that is being patched, because they can do a difference check between the sort of source code when they sort of reverse engineer that. And on average, it takes them 2 weeks to create a exploit that they then distribute amongst themselves that can be used to attack vulnerable systems. So that 2 weeks is there's a scientific reason behind that. In fact, there's found that a lot of cyber criminal gangs can actually reverse engineer it much quicker. So you always have that, whilst the 14 days the target, patching as quick as possible, especially where you've got services that are potentially internet facing. Then you should take particular care in that as well.
Also, mobile devices are in scope as well. So looking at your operating system for mobile devices, including those devices which access your network, but bring your own devices, so personal devices.
Yeah.
There should be a requirement where you ask users to make sure that the devices are up to date prior to accessing your data.
Cool. Then the last two I'm going to touch on very quickly. So access control. So this is the principle about not giving users more access than they need. And this is particularly also around giving them privileged access. So what we normally call local administrator access, or even administrator level access to cloud services. So this is about organizations just being mindful how they give access to staff and whether that aligns with their role. And that basically restricts access on a need to know basis. Again, the importance of this control is if a user account is compromised, then you can potentially contain the damage of that compromise if that user only has access to a small amount of data or a small amount of functionality in line with their role. And then where users have more senior roles or more privileged roles, then you can take more specific action around making sure those accounts stay secure. So, for example, making sure that the password is a lot more complex for those accounts that are more privileged, and enforcing multi-factor access, maybe more regularly asking for the multi-factor code for those accounts. Again, just to combat account takeover. And then the last one is anti-malware. So that's whether you've got Windows Defender installed or any of the other sort of big brand malware controls as well. So those are the 5 really.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, I mean, and just to reiterate, just that speaking as a self-confessed non-technical person who works amongst really talented technical colleagues, these are standards that every organization should have in place, aren't they? These are not, as I said, extra special standards. But if you are on the call and this feels a little bit overwhelming, please reach out to us on the back of today's webinar. We'd be more than happy to help you understand where to go with this and next steps. So we've talked a lot about supply chain. It's so important, and so many news and media stories about cyber attacks relate directly to supply chain incidents. Most recent stats suggest that nearly every company has been negatively impacted by a breach in this way. And since 2022, Boston Consulting Group is reporting a 633% year-on-year increase in supply chain attacks, which is an absolutely stunning number. They'll be targeting third-party software providers, your website builders, third-party data stores. And recent research suggests that only 13% of businesses are reviewing the risks posed by their immediate suppliers. And I'll ask Maritz and Paris to comment on, because we talk a lot about how far can you risk assess your supply chain realistically. And only 7% are reviewing the risks posed by that wider supply chain beyond the immediate suppliers they work with. And nearly 60% of SMEs do not understand the components or links in their own supply chain, and only 9% admit they have no knowledge at all or understanding of their supply chain or business customers. And that doesn't just relate to cybersecurity, that's across the business operation as a whole. So I'd invite you both to share some thoughts on these facts and numbers, because it's quite concerning, isn't it?
I would say a lot of organizations may see the word supply chain and go, we don't have a supply chain.
Yeah. Yeah.
But actually, all it is third parties providing you services.
Mm.
If you use a cloud service like a CRM system or a finance system, you have a supply chain, because they are suppliers of a service to your business, and that service happens to be the finance system. So you should understand what information, for example, on that example, you need to understand what information are you actually putting on the system of your business, and therefore, if that system gets compromised, what is the risk to my business? What could actually happen if I lose my finance system? How big an issue is that for me? Can I actually operate at all? I mean, I need to raise invoices. I need to sort of pay people. How big an issue is that for me? And yeah, so I think the supply chain, the digital supply chain, is really the important one we need to look at here. Obviously, there's the physical supply chain as well, but it's that supply chain of digital services that is quite important. Even if you buy software off the market, that is still a supply chain, because they will have people below them that actually provides them with services as well. So I think the first part would be just to at least take stock of who your third parties are that you use, and get a bit of an understanding, work through what is the risk around, what happens if the data we put on there is compromised, what happens if the data is deleted, what happens if our user accounts are compromised, and if somebody gains access to that system, what can they do? Some of those basic questions you need to ask about those sort of platforms, because then you can say, okay, so what is our expectations around how securely they manage their environment? What do we want to see? Do we want to see them have Cyber Essentials Plus? Do we want to see them have ISO 27001? Do we want SOC 2 or something like that? So obviously, some of those questions you need a little bit of an understanding of cybersecurity. But
I think
if anything, you need to have an element of that initial analysis to understand where you're potentially exposed.
as a follow-up to that, I think it's also important the businesses understand their obligations when contracting with these parties. They will generally expect the supplier to be obliged to put in place security controls. But what they might find is suppliers give them the capability, but the businesses themselves have to actually implement the security controls on their platform. So as an example, we see the likes of Microsoft. You might contract with them for a Microsoft 365, and I say this from experience because I've only done this week, and you might see that, well, it's Microsoft, everything must be secure, but it's actually the obligation is on you to implement those controls that Cyber Essentials, for example, has put together. But that's an oversight, really. So those are the questions that should be asked when you're acquiring new contractors and vendors and suppliers.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth noting, isn't it, that even though an organization might pass on the activity to a third party to carry out on their behalf, that doesn't remove the responsibility from us, for instance, from a UK GDPR perspective in terms of the processing of personal data. So that remains with you as the original organization. So that's something to bear in mind. And supply chain goes way beyond this subject, doesn't it? It goes way beyond cybersecurity. Every organization should have a general understanding of the supply chain and include that in their business continuity planning. So supply chain is very much a cybersecurity issue, but from a business perspective, it's just one of the issues with supply chains, which is so outside of cybersecurity, we'd always urge organizations to have a much greater understanding
We just
of
got a quick question in there from Neil Harris, who says, I'm surprised that then user training is not part of Cyber Essentials. Is that really the case? Yes, it is, because Cyber Essentials is technical control. It's specifically technical controls. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do end user training. That's absolutely key. The human firewall. Richard is our human firewall expert. He always sort of evangelizes about making sure that your staff don't click on links, your staff aren't subject to social engineering attack. But Cyber Essentials is specifically a technical standard, and that's why it very much focuses on the technical controls.
There is a theme around promoting culture, cyber culture within the Cyber Essentials. They're asking you how you encourage staff to create passwords and manage passwords, etc. But of course, it's not a specific requirement. But really it's Cyber Essentials as a tool to add to improving your cybersecurity culture, where you're asking users in the business to say, well, for us to meet Cyber Essentials requirements, we need to be doing this. We need to be ensuring passwords are secure, etc.
Absolutely, yeah. And if anyone's interested in, we've covered human firewall and business culture and cybersecurity culture in previous webinars in this series, and the link to those previous webinar recordings is in the slides that you will be sent following today's session. It's all part of a bigger picture. So let's talk about contracts, bids, and tenders in respect of Cyber Essentials. This isn't a new thing, but it's increasingly a theme. We see this in terms of the reasons that clients come to us for support with Cyber Essentials. It's not just about public sector contracts. It's something we see in general contract bids and tenders. We're seeing it a lot in terms of mergers and acquisitions, or when organizations or businesses are sold, in terms of due diligence. But it is a prerequisite for bidding in public sector contracts in particular, and very much so with the Ministry of Defence, and a huge number of government projects and contracts now. Local authorities also now requiring Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus as a fixed requirement at the beginning of the bidding process. So unfortunately, we find clients coming to us at the last minute because they'd like to bid for a contract and discover that straight away they need to have Cyber Essentials in place before they can make an application. And many private sector organisations now are asking for Cyber Essentials as an evidence of baseline requirements. And an interesting stat from HBP Group, they've quoted here that when reviewing over 50 tenders they've had access to in the last 6 months, and that is the last 6 months just gone, all but 2 of those specifically asked about Cyber Essentials, and all of those tenders were asking questions about cybersecurity and data protection. So what they're saying there is that in 96% of instances, if you're bidding for contracts and tenders, there's a good chance that you're going to be either asked questions about cybersecurity standards or to actually have Cyber Essentials to Cyber Essentials Plus. So from your perspective, is this something that is growing and is something that you think will just continue to grow?
Yeah,
sorry, you go, Paris. You want to go first?
Yeah, I was just going to answer one of the questions as well with that. I think it is becoming quite a important requirement in a lot of contracting, during bidding and contracting and acquiring new services. So even where you're selling products to clients abroad, to suppliers outside of the UK or customers outside the UK, these requirements are coming up as to what is your organization doing surrounding cybersecurity. It might not be a specific requirement such as Cyber Essentials, but it is something that's asked. A lot of the US-based client base are asking for SOC 2. I'm sure Maritz will touch on that a little bit. So it doesn't really have to be specifically Cyber Essentials, but Cyber Essentials is one of many standards, frameworks that an organization can adopt, really, to show that they're doing something around cybersecurity.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I think the other thing we're seeing as well is, even if you don't have Cyber Essentials as part of the contract, if you win the contract, then you have to sign an obligation to say you're going to get Cyber Essentials within X amount of months.
Okay.
Or so on. So often that's sort of part of the arrangement, at least, or be able to demonstrate that you've got those cybersecurity controls in place. Definitely.
Yeah. So generally, the main takeaway from this screen is, if you haven't got Cyber Essentials and you're involved in these areas, you're probably going to need to get it in the very near future, I think. So I'm conscious we've got some questions coming in sort of hard and fast. So I'd invite Maritz and Paris to sort of pick those up. And
I'll pick up the first one. Is Cyber Essentials managed by IT support, especially where this is managed by a third party and agency? I would say you always need to take responsibility for Cyber Essentials yourself, even though the controls are provided and delivered by a third party, potentially normally we engage with the IT support guys to do the assessment. But ultimately Cyber Essentials, especially the basic one, management has to sign off that those controls are in place, right? So the self-assessment one is very much senior management saying those controls are in place. So they need to have sufficient oversight to be able to sign that Cyber Essentials attestation ultimately. So whilst the controls are probably managed by the IT guys. The controls are very much technical. There's a little bit of overlap maybe for joiners, movers and levers around access control. Ultimately, when you look at sort of who needs to take ownership of it, it needs to be senior management ultimately. And then ultimately you'll also need to have some sort of control in place to make sure that if it's a service provider or an IT company, have you got metrics to sort of show that they're patching, for example, or can they demonstrate that people don't have local administrator access, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'll pick up the next one. So we're a medium-sized charity and have Cyber Essentials Plus. Is there a need to go for ISO 27001? I think people don't, as Maritz said earlier, Cyber Essentials is very much a technical set of controls, and ISO 27001 is just looking at your information security management system. So it gives you best practice guidelines and standards to apply to risk management, security controls. That doesn't only cover cyber security, but also other areas of business, and also governance around how you manage information in the organization. So do you have to go for it? Probably not, unless it's a requirement.
Really depends, yeah, if it's a requirement. I think the scope of ISO 27000 is much broader than just the cybersecurity controls. It talks about managing information security across the whole business, both from a physical perspective, your people side of things. It's a much bigger undertaking. So I would say 27001 is something that you do if you maybe a slightly large organization and you need a lot of coordination around security, and you need to make sure that certain things happen within the organization and that you then align with the wider set of controls that's sort of outlined within 27001. It's quite a big commitment because you will need to allocate resources to it, both from an implementation perspective and also a day-to-day running of it. So it's not a decision that needs to be taken lightly, whether you want to go for 27001. But it's a brilliant standard to be able to show to your trustees, to your partners, that you actually have that, and also to to anybody within your sort of stakeholder ecosystem, that you really take information security seriously, and you've got the sort of structural arrangements within the organization to be able to look after that.
Yeah.
And I just noticed somebody commented on my email address. So
Yeah.
I don't have an email address.
Yes.
I'm just like Chuck Norris. I just have a domain.
You're that important. You don't need a domain, Maritz.
No.
Yeah, apologies. That's on me, that one. And I would comment on, so anyone who's attending today from a charity or a non-profit organization, we have some really good specific resources that if you're interested in, I can send them to you. So please drop me an email, and I can sort of point you in the right direction.
There's another good question in the list there. Is there a checklist you can use or specific resource to provide to senior managers who have the role of oversight of cybersecurity? So the National Cybersecurity actually have a board toolkit, I think. And what we'll do is we can sort of share we'll just share the link to the toolkit as well, because that's a really useful toolkit. It's been around for a few years, but it's still very relevant for the board. So it's almost got like a bit of a KPI type arrangement, and these are the things the board need to look out for. So I think that'll be really useful for senior management.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've shared the link in the question answer.
Yeah, we'll probably just add that link into the email that goes afterwards with that as well.
Yeah.
Richard, if you can just take a note of that.
Brilliant. Well, thanks to you both for it's flown by, this one. So just to say before we wrap up for today, thanks to Maritz and Paris for another brilliant session. Next time out, it's only less than 3 weeks away, actually. We'll be Maritz and I will be back again, this time with Benji, our colleague from the IT assurance team within more ClearComm. We'll be talking about IT audits and best practice on Wednesday, 20th of March. It'd be fantastic if you could join us. Maritz, as soon as we've got a couple of minutes, could you just give us a brief overview of what we would be looking to kind of cover within that hour, who it might relate to?
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So this is probably a session for organizations who've got maybe a slightly more structured governance arrangement within the organization where you may have an IT or an internal audit or some sort of oversight type arrangement. So for IT audits, the kind of work we do is we look at IT environments, we look at how the IT environment's managed, we assess it against good practice. We look at some key controls within IT around change control, around access control, around sort of backup and recovery and those sort of things. So an IT audit is really there to sort of really kick the tires of the IT service provision within the organization. It could actually be a review of an application. It could be anything really, anything IT related can be sort of be covered off as an IT audit and IT assurance side of things. And we'll talk a little bit about maybe SOC 2. We'll talk a little bit about some of the other attestation standards that are out there that organizations use as well. So I think it'll be quite an interesting conversation.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. So again, we have, this is the 7th episode. So all of the 6 previous webinars from the series are available on the More Kingston Smith YouTube channel. And when you receive the slides, if you're not visiting the YouTube channel in between now and then, where the previous episodes icon is at the bottom of the screen, you can click that icon and it will take you to the More Kingston Smith YouTube channel. And not only are the more ClearComm videos there, but there's also a vast array of really useful, beneficial webinars from More Kingston Smith as well on a wide range of subjects. So again, thank you very much for attending. I hope you have a brilliant end of the week and a lovely weekend. Thanks again to Maritz and Paris for their fantastic and expert insights. And we'll see you hopefully on March the 20th. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.